Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. In today's video I'm going to be doing the much requested walkthrough of GCSE Sociology paper 2 for AQA. So this paper is on crime and deviance and social stratification. I'm going to try and split this into two parts, one part on crime and deviance and one part on social stratification, just because otherwise the video is going to get really long. So this is actually the 2019 paper. You can find this on the AQA website, though I will also be putting up the questions that I'm answering just here for you guys to have a little look at. But if you do want to follow along or attempt the paper first by yourself, I will leave a link in the description to the sample paper for you guys to give it a go. We also have the mark schemes on there if you wanted to mark your own paper. The answers that I'm going to be giving are not the only answers for some of the questions. There are some where you can answer several different things, but I have tried to write up just a couple to go through for the purposes of this video. So we begin with the 1 mark and the 1 mark questions. These ones are quite simple. They're just multiple choice. They're just based on your knowledge and your revision. There's not really much else you need to do aside from just colour in the box of what you believe is the correct answer, and just make sure you do colour in the box completely, because just a tick or a cross won't be accepted. It does say that at the top of the page, so just make sure you're doing that. So question 1 for this paper is, what term is commonly used by sociologists to describe the lenient treatment of women in the criminal justice system? So the answer to this one is B, it's the chivalry thesis. Again, for these really is just having the basic knowledge, which mostly of key terms, sometimes of a concept. I think they apparently were quite nasty in the paper 1, so hopefully they're a bit nicer in paper 2. And what term is commonly used by sociologists to describe public concern caused by the media's reporting of antisocial behaviour? And the answer to this one is C, it's moral panic. Alright, and then question 3 is a 3 mark question. So for these, you state something and then you have to elaborate on it a little bit. A lot of the marks here will come from your explanation of your point, but you definitely need to have the point at the beginning just to get all 3 marks. So describe one example of white collar crime. So the one that I've got here is corporate crime. So I've used the example of Barings Bank and Nick Leeson. You don't necessarily have to use a specific example, but I think if you have them, it's really helpful, especially if you want to do sociology at A level, where you will need the examples. It's a good practice to get into. So the way that I would answer this question is, one example of white collar crime is corporate crime. For example, Nick Leeson cost Barings Bank $1 billion, ended up bankrupting the company because of his illegal trading. Although you could also have something a bit more simple, so you could talk about occupational crime, for example, stealing from the workplace. This could be major or minor. You know, you might be using Works printer, that counts as stealing from your workplace, or you could be stealing products, you could be stealing, you know, more expensive things. Either way, that is an example of white collar crime as well. Okay, and question 4, identify and describe one source of data on crime. So for this one, I've just gone for official statistics. I feel like they're quite easy to remember when you're talking about research methods on crime. They're not necessarily the most reliable, but they are usually what first comes to mind. So I feel like for this question, that's what most people are going to go for. So one source of data on crime is official statistics, which come from the reported and recorded crime, government and police, usually in just the databases. They are a quantitative method, and they tend to be on quite a large scale. It's essentially just what we know about the crime that everyone knows about, because it is in these official police records and government records. The way that you'd probably write that in a question would be, yeah, so one source of data on crime is official statistics. This is a quantitative method or form of data that comes from police and government records. That would probably get you all 3 marks. You don't have to write too much. Just make sure you are getting the explanation. And for a 3 marker, try and get like 2 expansions. So for that one, my expansions would be, it's a quantitative method and it comes from police records and government records. It comes from government records as well. All right, and then we've got an item question. I quite like the item questions, especially the strength of their research, because all you really need to do to revise for that is just have a list of strengths and weaknesses of each different research method. And a lot of the time you can apply those to like different situations without having to know each specific research method in detail. Although you should know about these studies, you should have learned about these studies, because the later questions might expect you to know a bit more about them. So from item A, examine one strength of this research. So if we read the item, it says that she studied the role of girls in street gangs. She selected 3 gangs and spent 6 months for each gang, focusing on a particular girl in each gang. She used a range of methods such as unstructured interviews and overt observation. So already we know she's used more qualitative methods. And a strength of those is that they are more valid. They provide a clearer picture of what it's like in the reality rather than just looking at the numbers. You do get a much deeper feel for what's going on in these girl gangs. But I'd say for this one, another strength would be she was able to build a rapport with each of the girls in the gang, because she spent 6 months with them and she's focusing on a particular girl. Unstructured interviews of her observation. They're more likely to be truthful potentially because they have spent a lot of time with her. But if you just want to make it simple, it's qualitative data, so it's valid, provides a full picture of what it might be like in the real world. Question 6. Identify and explain one reason why the life goals of the girls did not differ for those in mainstream society, as referred to in item A. Now for this question, I would go for Merton's strain theory, which you should have studied in class. I would definitely recommend revising it for this paper because Merton's strain theory can be used for a lot of different things. It's actually come up when I was planning for this video and I was writing one of the 12 markers. I used Merton's strain theory a lot. So, right, Merton's strain theory, little brief run through for this question. So one reason why the life goals of the girls may not have differed from those in mainstream society would be because of Merton's strain theory. The girls decided to accept the goals offered by like the capitalist society, but they were not able to achieve, or they rejected the means to achieve these goals. As a result, they decided to innovate, which led them into a life of crime as an alternative means of achieving this status or of achieving, you know, the money, the success. It's basically what I put in my notes was just a Merton strain theory. They have a material goal, not the legitimate means, so they look for an alternative, which is to innovate. They accept the goal, not the means. As a result, they turn to crime to achieve the success. That's essentially what you need to put. All right, question 7. Identify and explain one disadvantage of using unstructured interviews to investigate delinquent behaviour. So there's a few you get here again. You can talk about, it's time consuming, it's expensive, it's going to be potentially difficult to locate a large sample because it's quite a restricted group, and you might have to go covert to get these interviews, which is going to be harder. More dangerous, less ethical. There's a lot of disadvantages you could come up with, but I feel like the ones that are going to be probably most common would be time consuming. So one disadvantage of using unstructured interviews to investigate delinquent behaviour is that it's time consuming. It's going to take the researcher time to locate and gain access to these gangs, and the actual process of the interviews is going to take longer than if you just issued a questionnaire. Is likely probably to be more accurate or truthful than a questionnaire, but you don't need to write that in the question. As a result, you may end up with a smaller sample size, which makes the research less representative, unless you are willing to spend the time and money to make it more representative, which potentially is not going to be feasible. Basically, you just need to expand on what time consuming and the issues that's going to raise. So if it's time consuming, you end up with a smaller sample, less representative study, and it's potentially going to be more costly. You can all link those together. Right, question 8. From item B, identify and describe one way in which Becker argued that behaviour can be labelled as deviant, including what you know and his perspective on deviance. So his study, right, Becker believed that all social groups make rules and attempt to enforce them. Becker wrote that social rules define situations and all kinds of behaviour, specifying some actions as right and forbidding others as wrong. Becker was interested in the way in which society created deviancy and labelled individuals as criminals. He suggested that no act is deviant in itself, but the act becomes so when society reacts against it. If the actions of a group or an individual are considered to be deviant, the agencies of social control, including the police and the courts, have the power to make this label stick. This label can become a master status, which will affect how others see them and respond to them. Right, so one way in which behaviour can be labelled as deviant. So the answer I wrote for this question was Becker, writing from an interactionist perspective, believed that rulemaking and laws came from groups within society. They're not rooted in some bigger reason, you know. It's just the individual groups labelling it as deviant. Society will react to certain behaviour. Some groups may be treated more leniently than others, and some actions may be treated more leniently than others. It's just, it depends on what groups are targeted and what those in power decide to label as deviant. So yeah, so identify and describe one way would be all social groups make rules and attempt to enforce them. So it'd be if certain groups react against it. So you could have, if you were to be more precise, you might have the government has decided that jaywalking is a deviant act. As a result, they will then label it as deviant, and then it becomes so. It's not necessarily, you know, there's some things that might be objectively right or wrong, like murder, but then you might have things that the group in charge of society has decided, oh no, we don't like this. Which then leads us into question 9, identify and explain one issue for sociologists when attempting to define deviance. Had a little look at the mark scheme for this one. One issue for sociologists when attempted to define deviance is the differences in cultural norms. So the expectation of what is deviant and non-deviant differs between different societies and different cultures, possibly even within subcultures. For example, you could talk about alcohol and how, you know, drinking alcohol can be a bit more normalised within the UK than it might be in other countries, where drinking alcohol is seen more deviant, seen as more problematic, and may even be illegal. It just really depends on different cultures and what they choose to define as a deviant act. There's not necessarily a set blanket of everywhere and everyone is going to see a certain act as wrong. It does depend on the culture. But you could probably condense that a bit more in an answer. Right, so question 10, I have decided to do question 10 a little bit differently. I fully planned out question 11, but question 10, I'm going to go through the planning and writing process of a 12 marker. So if you give me 1 second, I've got to go get a pen. Right, so I've got my pen. So I'm going to get a spare piece of paper as well. That would have been helpful maybe before. Right, so to begin with, you've got to make sure you're reading the question carefully. So discuss how far sociologists will agree that institutional racism remains an issue in the criminal justice system. So you know that your question is going to focus on institutional racism in the criminal justice system. So what we're going to do to begin with is we're going to sort of mind map some ideas. So the concepts. We know that interactionists like Becker, they talk about labelling by certain groups. So you could discuss, you discuss Becker, and you can talk about how maybe actions that may be more typically related to minority groups may be seen as deviant more than those by non-minority groups. One thing that was quite big in the debate would be drug use, like light drug use, obviously. You know, the debate about whether or not weed should be legalised. And there was a big debate about how this tends to affect certain social groups more than others, where it may not be inherently wrong to take these drugs, you know, for personal use, particularly when marijuana has been used for medical reasons as well. But the way that it's been labelled by society makes it seem more deviant. So you can talk about that maybe as an AO2. This is going to sound quite rambly. This is just me planning the essay from scratch. But as I say, for the next question, I have already planned it. Something that is good to mention in this one would be the Macpherson report, and the Stephen Lawrence case. It's actually come up in the news again recently. Last night, actually, when I was researching for this video, I saw that one of the killers of Stephen Lawrence has applied to move into an open prison, though he was seen as still a danger to society, so this request was refused. But the important thing about Stephen Lawrence case is how the police really did not handle it well. Rather than sort of spending lots of time investigating it, they messed it up in a lot of ways. It took a very long time for justice to actually be issued, which is a sign of institutional racism, that they're not caring about the crime as much just because it was a black boy that was killed, when, you know, it's still like someone's been killed, someone's been murdered, and like it's racially motivated. Surely that should be investigated, but it wasn't. So you can talk about how that was institutional racist, but you can also use it as an evaluation with the Macpherson report and how things attempted to change. But then you could evaluate that again and say, well, they haven't, because we still have some statistics here on, where is it gone? On Tutor to Use page, where in 2014, 65 Black, 23 Asian, 28 mixed race individuals being stopped and searched per 1,000 of the population, compared to 15 white individuals per 1,000 population. So that's 65 versus 15 if we're talking black versus white, which is massive difference, and not right, because that's not saying like, oh, these people have committed more crimes. This is saying they're being searched more, potentially randomly. You can talk about airport screening and how the random selection is not actually random. And that's the same thing about how that's continuing, even though we've had this Macpherson report, which has attempted to change it, it hasn't changed on balance. And you can talk about, I'm looking at the Marx scheme, the Marxist theory of relationship between racism and capitalism, something you can talk about. You can talk about mass media and stereotypes. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm trying to look for one that would be a disagree, because ideally you want to have, both sides. I mean, I personally, if I was answering this question, I would say I agree that the system, like institutional racism, remains an issue. But in the essay, you do want to have some of the other perspectives. But I probably go through mass media. Go through mass media as the next one, and how like the media tends to report crimes. There's been this massive thing recently with terrorism, and how you might have a white man goes over to a bunch of people, kills a bunch of people in like a political agenda, which is under the definition of terrorism, and he will still just be called, troubled or misunderstood rather than a terrorist. I think this is very clear in America, but it's also clear in the UK. So you could talk about, the terrorism label or the terrorist label, and how that only tends to apply to certain groups more than others. And the way I structure this into an essay is I do like 1, 2, and 3. I would write 3 different paragraphs. I had someone ask about like the ratio of the paragraphs. I tend to do 2 for the thing that I agree with and 1 for the thing I disagree with. I would always add evaluation in each, even if I did agree with it. But that's how I would sort of do it. In your introduction, you want to write your answer. So in our answer for this question that I've just planned, we would say, on balance, institutional racism does remain an issue. So I would always use the phrase on balance, just because I think it sounds clever. So inst racism, still an issue. And then for paragraph 1, I like to do what least agrees first, and then I like to go into what most agrees. For these questions, we have gone into more, like all 3 of them are agree, but we are going to evaluate them. So I would probably start with the interactionist one, because I think that's the one you could sort of use the most freedom with. So interactionist, Becker, what we label as deviant. So we can say, marijuana use, and how that affects certain communities more than others. Not inherently deviant, it's just what we've labelled it as, and how we choose to label things as deviant. But then you could evaluate this and be like, well, this is just because it's potentially dangerous. We regulate, we haven't made it illegal, we haven't necessarily made it deviant, but we regulate the use of cigarettes quite heavily. And they're dangerous, and that's why they're regulated. We could say it's because of that. But then we could also say, well, why not regulate marijuana as well? Because if it's unregulated, it's just more likely to increase as deviant. When it becomes someone's master status, they're more likely to go into more crime. It just really seems like they're targeting certain groups to make them seem more deviant than others. And then paragraph 2, I would probably go into maybe mass media. Actually, Macpherson report would probably have been good to start with, but we'll do that last. We can do it the other way around. So we can talk about mass media and the labels that are applied to different groups. For the same actions, you might have one person really demonized and the other person's just like, oh, he's just misunderstood, he's just got mental illness, which, I actually did a couple of years back. This is going on a tangent for a bit, but this is a good example. A couple of years back, when I applied for law originally at uni, I'm actually doing English Lit now, but I originally applied for law, and one of the examples I talked about in my personal statement and in my interview was the case of Lavinia Woodward, and how she was an Oxford student who she stabbed her boyfriend. She was under the influence, and she was allowed to like she got left really leniently, basically, because she was seen as too intelligent, she had too much of a future to throw that away. But what I sort of just talked about was how, you know, if this had been a black boy that had done it, if this has been even a white working class teenager who had done this, they would not have received the same treatment. And it's very much down to the identity of the individual and how they are portrayed. You could talk about this in loads of different essays as an example, because, you know, you've got women, you've got the gender issue, you've got the class issue, you've got the race issue. Like, you can talk about that example for a lot of different things, and that does go into media and the way she was portrayed as, you know, she's got too much potential. But then doesn't everyone have the potential? You know, if we're saying that she received a lenient sentence because she had too much of a future, why is that not true for everyone? Because you can't really determine whether or not someone has potential or a future just based off, I don't know, what you perceive as their identity. Right, and then next one, the Macpherson report and Stephen Lawrence case. You can talk about the failings in this case and how there were a lot of things that they were directed to change. You could say, oh, on one hand, this could be argued that there has been a change in the criminal justice system and it's no longer as institutionally racist as it was before. However, the fact that the stop and search statistics haven't changed that much, from it being 65 per 1,000 black people stop and search versus 15 per 1,000 white people stop and search, suggests that it hasn't really worked, it hasn't really applied, there hasn't really been this change. Although, you know, you've got movements like Black Lives Matter, which have attempted to, again, draw attention to this. We still have more incidents like the George Floyd. All of that stuff is still going on, no matter what these movements have tried to do. So on balance, there is still institutional racism, despite attention being brought to it. And then you'd write your conclusion where you just summarise what you've said. So in conclusion, the criminal justice system is still institutionally racist. This is seen through the difference in the stop and search statistics, as well as the way that the media portrays different crimes by different groups. Although attention has been brought to the fact that the criminal justice system is institutionally racist, the plans that were put in place to change it haven't really been achieved. So there is still more work that needs to be done. Pretty much just write something like that for your conclusion. All right, and then we go into the final question of this section on the 22-minute long video. This is why I wanted to split this into two parts. Discuss how far sociologists would agree that inadequate socialisation is the main cause of criminal and deviant behaviour. So again, for your introduction, you want to summarise your response. So my response to this would be that inadequate socialisation is not the main cause of criminal and deviant behaviour. I think a lot of the time it can be a class issue. I'd probably write mine more from a Marxist perspective. Of course, you don't have to answer the same way as me. The thing about these essays is you can argue either way. You're not going to lose marks if you agree or disagree. It's what you think you could argue the strongest case for. Just make sure you're using evidence and you're using evaluations throughout, and that's all that really matters. So my first paragraph, I've done the agree because my overall is disagree, and I've talked about Murray and the new right and how he talks about single mothers and the underclass, and how children become more deviant because they are not necessarily socialised as correctly, because they're raised in the underclass to become like the underclass. And I would evaluate this. There was actually a study by this group, I believe, called Gingerbread, where they found that children from single parent families were not more likely to be deviant or go into crime. This is a myth. There was no really evidence supporting it. And you can also talk about how it's very deterministic. It's saying that, oh, if you're born into the underclass, you're going to stay in the underclass, you're automatically going to turn to crime. That's not true. There are people that don't turn to crime, even though they were born into the underclass. So it can't really be the socialisation. It must be another factor. Next paragraph, I've said, the way I link these, if you're arguing something different. So according to Becker, labelling is a more important cause of criminal and deviant behaviour than inadequate socialisation. So you want to always mention inadequate socialisation and deviant behaviour in your links. So certain groups may be labelled deviant or outsider for even a minor action or a minor crime, or even just for existing. When they're in school, they might be labelled as deviant, even if they're not necessarily deviant from the beginning, or they might be labelled stupid, they might be labelled dumb. All of this can then lead to a self-fulfilling prophecy, which then increases the label until it becomes their master status. It's what they define themselves by. They define themselves as deviant, which will then lead to further crime, and so on and so on. An evaluation of this, again, is it's quite deterministic. It's assuming that if one person's labelled as deviant, they're going to continue into a life of crime. Not necessarily true. People can break out of their labels. People can reject their labels. And you could also link it back to socialisation again. So, well, socialisation is what initially introduces people to the norms and values of society. So if they had been socialised correctly, maybe they wouldn't have done anything that would have led to a deviant label. But then you can evaluate that again by, right, well, what do we define as a deviant label? We can't define a deviant label. A lot of the time it may be from different cultural norms, or it may just be that certain people are being targeted more than others and labelled deviant even if they haven't done anything deviant. You can talk about stop and search there. If someone's being constantly stop and search, being accused of being a criminal, what's to say they don't then think, well, I'm already being punished for it, why don't I just go ahead and commit the crime? You could talk about something like that. And then the final paragraph, I've talked about Merton's strain theory and how the main cause of criminal and deviant behaviour is the inability for people to achieve their goals. Now, I don't believe Merton was a Marxist. Let me just double check that. Right, yeah, I was correct. It's connected more to functionalism, but you could also expand on it a bit with the Marxist idea. So Merton's strain theory suggests that where people cannot may not be able to achieve the goals that society has socialised them to accept, they may then turn to alternative means to achieve them. They innovate. You could link this then to Marxism about how actually it's social class that may lead people to turn to crime, not their socialisation, just the fact that they're constantly being told they have to achieve these goals when they can't, and how, you know, they still want this material success. So the only way to do that would be to turn to crime. It's an innovation of the goals. And it's not necessarily the way they've been socialised. Everyone's been socialised in this sort of theory to aim for the same goals, and they may have been taught the legitimate means. It's just when that doesn't seem possible. So you can talk more about society and maybe inequality within society being the main cause of criminal and deviant behaviour, which is what I would say is most convincing. Inequality within society leads to criminal and deviant behaviour, which you could also have talked about in that paragraph above, and how it's inequality in the way people are labelled, and these stereotypes that are being issued. So on balance, inadequate socialisation is not the main cause of criminal and deviant behaviour. It's inequalities within society, the way we stereotype certain groups, and the way that material success is so imbalanced. Right, and that would be the end of the crime section of the paper. I do hope you found this helpful. It's been a little while since I've sat a sociology paper myself. I'm currently on a gap year wanting to study English, but this was actually the paper that I sat for my GCSE. This was the 2019 one. I sat my GCSEs in 2019, and I thought it was quite a good paper actually. I mean, I didn't come out in tears like I did in my maths paper, so there's always that. But I do hope you found this helpful. If you have any ideas for any other videos, please feel free to drop a comment down below. Let me know what you thought, and remember to leave a like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next video. Right, bye.